Hey guys, what's up? Sorry if I sound a bit beat up and tired in this video. It's spring, everything's blooming, and I have allergies. So, uh, yeah, I might sound a little messed up. But anyway, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion remake just came out. Everybody was talking about it. Everybody was buzzing about this remaster of Oblivion. And it turns out to be true. It was shadow dropped the same day that it was officially confirmed. And that's really cool because, like the Ninja Gaiden 2 Black remake that just came out recently, it's running on Unreal Engine 5. It looks really good. Looks great. And have we ever gotten a remake like this? Like a full-blown visual remaster like this from Bethesda, of all people? Like, I know they've re-released their games several times, like Skyrim or whatever, but a full-blown, like, remake, ground-up remake? Like, this is a pretty extensive remake, apparently. It's not just a facelift. Like, they actually, redid a lot of the animation. There's new voice work. Combat is better. There's, like, a whole bunch of new features that they've really, like, went out of their way. And apparently it was a third-party studio, Virtuoso or whatever it's called, that worked with Bethesda to do this remake. So it wasn't even like an in-house Bethesda thing. You know, they outsourced to this other company to do it, which is good. Hopefully it's not as buggy as your average Bethesda game. I mean, given how old it is, I hope it runs and performs better on consoles than Oblivion did back on the 360, which brings me to the real point of this video. I don't think I ever talked about it on here. I'm not the biggest Elder Scrolls fan. I'm not a huge fan of Bethesda. I'm not a huge fan of their style of game development and how they make video games. Their approach to open world has always been difficult for me to get into completely. Now, having said that, I do have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Oblivion. And it started, I actually played Morrowind back in the day on the original Xbox. I tried that one. That was my first try with Elder Scrolls, and I didn't care for it very much because I thought it played like dog shit. Big ambitious game, big open world, and for the time, especially on the original Xbox during that generation, it was pretty impressive how big, and like the scale of that game was impressive, but it played like dog shit. I mean, the controls, the graphics, it was not a particularly good game, I feel. But I guess if you had the patience to put up with a lot of that, you know, it was fine. But then Oblivion came out, and because I had already tried Morrowind and Oblivion looked so much better, it was running on much stronger technology, it was coming out on the 360, I was willing to give that one a try. And I can honestly say, before I get to my litany of criticisms for Oblivion back on the 360, we're not talking about, you know, when it was on PC and people later modded the hell out of it. No, that's the luxury of PC gamers. I'm talking about, you know, the console release of this big, ambitious, and very technically flawed game at the time. Before I get to all that, I do want to say that Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion is a game I actually do have some nostalgia for. Like, when this remake was announced and revealed, there was a part of me that was like, okay, it's $50, you know, really don't have that right now, really don't want to spend it, but will I at some point want to pick this up in the future? In the future, would I pick this up? Maybe. I don't know, because there is some nostalgia for Oblivion at this point. I haven't played it since it came out on the 360. And there is some nostalgia. There was something special about Oblivion back in 2006. There was something special about that game. It was the first of many. It was the first of its kind in some respects. I mean, I know it was still following mostly the familiar blueprint of other Elder Scrolls style games that had come before that. But I mean, it was running on that technology. It was the first time that I think I ever played an open world game that had such a gorgeous world to run around in. Like, it was the first time I think ever in a video game where like I saw a big grassy hill in the distance and it wasn't just a pretty background. You could run over there. Like, now that's like the most mundane thing a game can do because all games are huge now. You know, you look at Elden Ring recently and it's like, yeah, Oblivion, really nothing special anymore in terms of like pushing the envelope, but at the time there weren't many games that were that open-ended, you know, just in terms of play space, you know, just having a sandbox like that. You know, sure, we had like GTA and games that ripped off GTA, big open cities to drive around in, but for a fantasy game, this was like the first time I'd ever seen like, wow, look at all these rolling hills and these beautiful forests and caves and all that. And it's like, ooh, this is a really pretty game. It was enchanting as hell at the time. And it had all this great lighting and physics and beautiful texturing and everything that at the time, because this was the start of the 360 era, you know, the graphics were very big. Like, that was my first game of the HD era. So, you know, it was a visual showpiece at the time. So I want to say that playing Oblivion for the first time, it was definitely like, I want to say it's like one of the best honeymoon phases I've ever had with a game. Like, if that's the best way to put it. Like, you know, every game, new game you play has that honeymoon phase where it's like, you know, if it does well with first impressions, if you have a game that really wows you from the beginning, that's the honeymoon phase, you know? The real question becomes, can it hold my attention when it comes to lasting appeal? You know, will I come back to it repeatedly? How long will the wow factor last? Whether it's the graphics, the size of the game, you know, the freedom of it, the mechanics, all that stuff, the density of it. And unfortunately, that's the problem with Oblivion. I can't think of any video game more than Oblivion that kind of falls apart the more you play it, especially on console at that time. I know PC gamers were able to mod shit later on and improve and fix the bugs and everything else, but, you know, when it comes to console games, when you're a console player, you know, the game has to work well right from the start, and it can't go bugging out and glitching out the more time you spend with it to the point where it becomes unplayable. And unfortunately, that's what happened to me with Oblivion. The bugs, the glitches eventually made the game unplayable, but even before that started happening, because it's funny, like in the early weeks that I was playing it, it worked fine. It performed well enough at the time. I didn't really have any like major technical issues, but even before that started popping up, and this is a problem that I have with most Bethesda games, including Skyrim to a slightly lesser degree, or Fallout or whatever, is that the more time I run around in their game worlds, the less immersive it feels. The more artificial, and, you know, the NPCs are very puppet-like. The world itself starts to feel more and more like a dollhouse, you know, like there's an artificiality to the Elder Scrolls games and a lot of Bethesda's style of games that I mean, you either love it or hate it. And some people love it, some people think that's part of the charm. And looking back on it now, after all these years, with how much games have evolved technologically, even though there were games at that time that, at the time of Oblivion's release, that, you know, looked a lot more natural or whatever. For a big open world game like that at the time, that world and that sense of freedom was enough to make me look past all that. But over time, it's like, yeah, this game really feels kind of hollow. There's things like just the way the NPCs act and how they emote, and also like how stiff they could be when you engage them in conversation. I mean, that's been covered by people before at this point, but there's stuff like that. And then there's stuff like, you know, it does like what Elden Ring does now, and a lot of games were inspired by, where like you have a big open world and you have all these mini dungeons you can explore, and fine. But I remember playing it at the time, and every time I found a new dungeon, it got more and more like dull, because every dungeon I found was kind of uneventful. They were all the same. There was just like, they were kind of cookie cutter, and you don't get like a cool boss at the end of the dungeons like you do in you know, an Elden Ring game, where you go to the mini dungeons and there's always a cool, unique boss that you might not see again. I mean, I know there's some recycled bosses and enemies in Elden Ring, but the thing that sets a lot of other games of this kind apart from something like Oblivion is that Oblivion really lacks memorable, unique moments. Memorable, unique moments that don't repeat as you play the game. And this is the problem. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of dialogue and there's a lot of written stuff in Oblivion, and I think a lot of the game kind of leans on that, and you're left to fill in a lot of the gaps yourself with your imagination. But there's so many cookie cutter things, repeating NPCs with repeating voices, and they all kind of start to blur together after a while, and the dungeons all start to blur together after a while because there's nothing unique waiting at the end of each of them. There's nothing to set each dungeon apart. So it's like, after a while, even the treasure you find just kind of, it just feels like stock assets. And everything in Oblivion feels that way. Now, I don't know if this remake fixed that. That's the one thing I don't know if this remake actually, like, was able to fix a bit. Maybe add some cool, like, unique one-off bosses at the end of a dungeon or something like that. I know the combat in Oblivion's not that complex anyway. It's not the main draw of the game necessarily. But it's still cool to see, like, hey, maybe there's a unique enemy that I won't see again later in the game. But, like, every thing in the game, even the environments to some degree, start to feel a little like, you know, repeated, you know? Like, it starts to feel like the whole game is just, they had a bunch of assets they made, and they just reused them over and over again, rather than, you know, having some unique stuff, you know? And I know maybe they got a bit better with that in later Bethesda games. I don't know, because after Skyrim, I kind of stopped playing Bethesda games after that. I kind of lost interest trying them anymore, because other stuff came around, like From Software's style of open world fantasy games, that I think are better and handle that stuff better. I know there's still different approaches, because Oblivion's a lot more with NPC character interaction than something like Elden Ring. But still, I'll take that, because what I like about something like Elden Ring is, even when it comes to NPCs, okay, there's not as many NPCs to interact with in Elden Ring as there is in Oblivion, but, or Skyrim or whatever, but like, at least each of them are going to be unique. Every NPC you come across is gonna be unique. Hell, even like, when you're wandering around Elden Ring and you find like the turtle with the Pope hat, or the freaking big jar guy with the arms, like, there's so many weird, unique things that to discover in that game's world. And like, it's strange that, like, when you play a game like Oblivion, it doesn't have that. It doesn't have as much of that. There's not as much memorable, unique stuff in the game, whether it's NPCs, enemies, or whatever. The more you play it, the more that stuff starts to blur together. And that's before you even get to the massive crashing and bugs and glitches that started to ruin my experience after a while when I was playing it on 360. So, like, yeah. Having said that, even with all those issues, even if the game's a little hollow at the center, you know, it does have a story campaign. I know there's a story campaign and there's lots of dialogue, but again, all that starts to kind of blur together and feel a bit hollow, because there's not much outside of the game's own lore, which is already a little stuffy and pretty Tolkien-esque. So, like, it's not super unique, but, you know, there's not a whole lot to latch on to. But having said that, there is a certain charm to Oblivion, you know, that does pull you in before that stuff starts to wear on you. And I can at least, you know, understand some of the charm that people still are drawn to with this game. Like, the atmosphere, for one thing, is actually really nice. The game has a great soundtrack. It's beautiful. Like, it has some of the most beautiful music I've ever heard in an open world fantasy game. Like, it's got really nice, soothing music that, like, I think it's one of the most nostalgic parts of the game for me. But even just walking around the environment and hearing that music and uh, just kind of engaging in its world, kind of has a laid back, you know, to the game's credit, it's not like something like From Software where the experience is always so intense and always so brooding and always has that forward momentum, you know, which is a good thing in those games. But there's also something to be said for an open world fantasy sandbox that is a little more laid back, that does let you just kind of live in its world. And even though I wish that world had a bit more distinct detail to kind of separate its NPCs and environments and everything, and its quest, I do think there's a certain surface level like charm. It may lack a bit of a center to kind of reel it all in. You know, it may lack some depth in that department, but I do think there's a certain charm. And if this remake irons out a lot of those technical issues and does beef up the game's visuals and beef up its playability to a level that, you know, is much more in line with modern games, yeah, I could see myself coming back to it. I definitely think there's enough nostalgia there. There's enough nostalgia in Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. You know, I don't look back on it as, like, a bad game, necessarily, but it is a game that is hard to appreciate as fully, you know, as something like Elden Ring. You know what I mean? When it comes to open-world fantasy games. Like, I do think Elden Ring is a much better game. You know, even if at the same time, you know, once I've finished that and it's DLC, it's kind of hard to go back to just because the sense of discovery is lost once you've seen everything there is to see, which takes a long time. I mean, you know, that's not a huge issue when you consider the memories that game will create on that first playthrough, but, you know, I can understand there's a certain cozy sandbox charm to Oblivion that people still are drawn to. Because it is kind of a cozy game. There is a certain cozy, and yes, I'll even go so far as to say some of the jankiness of, like, the NPCs and stuff, and the goofiness of the dialogue has a certain charm. It does. It has a certain charm. You know, it's the same charm that keeps people coming back to games like Shenmue. You know, janky as hell game with lots of weird, goofy NPC interactions, but people still like it, you know, even if it does kind of lack a lot of there's a lot of the refinements that I typically look for in video games, you know, when it comes to, like, structure and character depth and stuff like that. So, yeah, I might actually, at some point in the future, play the Oblivion remake. Maybe. Possibly. But if I do, it will be a while from now, and maybe I'll have more thoughts on that, you know, kind of a retrospective review on how it's changed and how it differs from playing it for the first time on 360. But yeah, it was a breathtaking game at the time, despite eventually crumbling apart the more I played it. You know, I do have some fond memories of Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, in spite of all that. You know, more so than any of Bethesda's later games. Like, I played Skyrim later, and honestly, even though I think it made some improvements here and there, I liked Oblivion a lot more when it was working, when it wasn't crashing on me. It was a really pretty game, and it did have, like, a more enchanting, colorful feel to it. Whereas I feel like Skyrim kind of, I don't know, it wasn't as appealing to me, that game. And maybe that's what turned me off to Bethesda after that. And it's funny because that's not a controversial opinion. A lot of people seem to think Oblivion was the better Elder Scrolls game than Skyrim. So you guys can let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section below. And until next time, you get to burning and live for the passion. Ciao.